Hi, welcome to the second panel of the day on election interference cases from around the globe. I hope you enjoyed the lunch and are energized for the session. As Graham Brookie mentioned in his keynote, this year has been the year of elections, and here with me are three experts, Mr. Pieter Pandy, Dr. Samantha Bradshaw, and Professor Paolo Cesarini to inform us on election interference in different parts of the world. Your Slido QR codes are on your tables, so you can start posting your questions as the speakers go through their presentations. Without further ado, let me leave the floor to Mr. Pieter Pandy.
How do I switch to the slides? Thank you, Gulzar. So, introductions first. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Pieter Pandy from CSIS Indonesia. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me for the opportunity to speak here. And since this is what is known as the graveyard shift, the after lunch shift, I'll try to be as enthusiastic and engaging as possible. But please spare me from the difficult questions. So, to plug in the research program and the lab that I work at, it's called the Safer Internet Lab at CSIS Indonesia, which is a collaboration between us and Google. We're in the second year of our research, and the program aims to identify policy gaps and points of intervention, mainly focused on the information landscape in Indonesia initially, and now being spread to Southeast Asia and the region more broadly. So in the second year of our research, we've identified three sort of research streams. The first focusing on deepfakes and financial fraud incidents throughout the region. The second focusing on foreign information and manipulation and interference. And the third focusing on impact of disinformation towards democratic resilience in Southeast Asia. And because the topic of this session is on elections, I'll be presenting data on the latter two. FIMI incidents that have arisen because of great power concentration in the Indo-Pacific and its impact on elections, but a little bit focusing on the 2024 Indonesia presidential elections since it's just happened. So what are the early challenges of discussing FIMI? FIMI is rarely discussed. I think in Southeast Asia, most of the discussion is geared towards disinformation, but it's still mostly domestic focused. FIMI is rarely discussed in the open either because of hesitation of countries to admit that their information landscape is being compromised. That could be one of the reasons. The second reason is also possibly because FIMI is simply not within the threat perception of some governments. It could be also because some governments, which we'll get into later, benefits or is willing to let certain incidents of FIMI narratives fester in their information landscapes because they don't see it as detrimental to the political dynamics within their own countries. So as part of the year two of our research on foreign information manipulation and interference, we've tried to sort of construct a database of FIMI incidents in Southeast Asia, Australia, and Taiwan from 2019 to 2014. And these are just some of the definitions and subcategories of foreign influence that we've tried to identify as part of our database. And here are some of the early findings of our research. So by category, we've identified that digital media influence is still, broadly speaking, the main entry point for FIMI operations in Southeast Asia. Although it's not sort of widely discussed amongst policymakers, especially in countries such as Indonesia, which we'll get into the reasons later, the volume increases essentially not during elections, but during times of international conflict or international events. So early hypotheses as to why this happens is mostly because we think that foreign actors, great powers, engage in influence operations much less to reach for certain political outcomes in elections in Southeast Asia, but more to shape narratives according to what they want to foreign events. So in the context of, we see a spike in 2022, which is when the Russian invasion of Ukraine happened. And that's when sort of disinformation campaigns, influence operations spiked up, especially in countries like Indonesia, where pro-Russian narratives are starting to circulate within the information landscape to sort of shape public opinion on why this incident has occurred. These are some of the early findings as well, divided by country, and you can see the reason we chose Taiwan and Australia to be part of this research, even though most of the countries are in Southeast Asia, is because Taiwan and Australia we chose because Taiwan was an example of severity of impact, because they have the obvious adversary in China, and their disinformation campaigns that they face would obviously be much more severe compared to countries with a much less obvious adversary. And Australia, because they also face that same sort of intensity, but we judged would be more capable of addressing these issues, and more willing, politically willing to address them publicly, compared to a lot of Southeast Asian nations who are most of the time kind of ambivalent in how they address it. Like a country such as Indonesia, they would identify a case of disinformation, but would not attribute it to a certain source, which makes it sort of difficult to identify whether or not that case of disinformation was was domestically originated or coming from foreign entities. And these are the FIMI incidents divided by influence actor. We do see some of the usual suspects, such as China, Russia, and even Iran, but also the United States we've identified have engaged in some influence operations. I think an interesting tidbit that I hosted a discussion last week in Jakarta about trying to gather perspectives from experts in the region, and one of the interesting takeaways was that oftentimes when influence operations occur from countries who are not more obvious adversaries, who are more allies, they tend to be more effective in influencing public narratives within the country itself, as opposed to influence operations that come from countries that are more obvious adversaries to some in Southeast Asia. So moving on to election interference more specifically, I think the sources of disinformation, the information landscape of different countries in Southeast Asia differs in the election periods of some Southeast Asian states. I chose a picture of the Filipino elections in 2022 and the Indonesian elections in 2024 here as examples of similar information landscapes where the sources of disinformation were mostly domestic, and there haven't been any publicly identified sources or incidents of FIMI identified. This could be for various reasons. Also, there are different threat perceptions, as we've discussed earlier. Disinformation, while it's considered as a challenge, not all governments in Southeast Asia consider FIMI as a threat. It's also part of the reason why it's difficult to attribute the exact source. Sometimes it is difficult, but sometimes governments who are willing, who can attribute it, are not so willing to admit to it publicly. And this is because some governments also benefit from disinformation during election periods, because it either reinforces certain public notions or public opinions that are beneficial for them, or they participate in it themselves. Moving on to a snapshot of the 2024 Indonesian presidential elections. Just as provide some background context for the information landscape in Indonesia, social media is a growing thing in Indonesia. More and more people are becoming exposed to it, more and more people are joining social media, and it's because part of it is because we have such a big population, but also internet access and exposure to social media has increased in recent years as well. As we can see in the graph here, social media users in Indonesia is forecasted to continuously increase by 39 million users. So by 2028, we'll have a lot more than we did in 2019. And consequently, that also changes how social media impacts society as well, and how politicians and political parties use social media as part of their political campaigns. As we've covered before, it is a new avenue for political campaigns, but also the nature of political campaigns have changed as well. In 2019, for instance, in the presidential election, most of the political ads or political campaigns that were held on social media were mostly text or image-based, because they were the dominant sort of platform in Indonesia. So platforms such as Instagram, before there were Reels, X, formerly known as Twitter, they were the sort of dominant social media platforms that were still text or image-based. Whereas in 2024, with the platforms such as TikTok and the addition of Instagram Reels and YouTube Shorts, the nature of political campaigns and disinformation at that has changed towards video and audio based. And that's also affected how disinformation has spread as well. Yeah, we've covered this. So disinformation that combines text and visual elements appear to be more effective and dominant and appealing, and also certainly a little bit more convincing for some in Indonesia, specifically because it is often difficult to differentiate, an AI-generated audio of political elites discussing to each other is really difficult to identify to the layman without the help of fact checkers. And that is precisely why disinformation campaigns have become more widespread. So these are some of the examples of disinformation during the 2024 elections. I talked a little bit on lunchtime that the example that the major from Ukraine showed of the deepfake of the Ukrainian soldier with the face of the Russian filmographer was pretty convincing. And I was quite shocked as to the quality of that deepfake. Whereas here we see a deepfake of our President Suharto, who has passed and is campaigning for a certain political candidate in the 2024 elections, which was not as well done as the example that we see earlier on. But it still managed to fool some people into thinking that Suharto did support a certain political candidate a long time ago. So I think it is difficult for a lot of people especially who aren't as digitally literate as some people are, to differentiate between what's real and what's fake, regardless of the quality of the deepfake. Also, we see here two other examples of AI-generated audio. Playing on the middle is of two political elites. One of them was the presidential candidate as well, Anies Baswedan, who is being berated by the head of the political party who backs him, so to sort of sow this sort of narrative that there is disagreements or they don't like each other, when in actuality it was AI generated. And the last one is an AI generated audio of Prabowo Subianto delivering a speech in Arabic when, to my knowledge, I don't think he speaks Arabic fluently and enough to give a speech. So I think that is another play on sort of giving the impression that he's multilingual or stuff like that. One thing that you might notice is that the nature of this disinformation, while it is AI-generated video or audio, the message or the sort of field that they play in is also different from the 2019 elections. If you follow Indonesian politics from 2016 to 2019, the sort of dominant narrative that was being played as far as disinformation campaigns go was focused on identity politics. So trying to converge differences in race, religion, and so on and so forth was the dominant way to deliver political messages. Whereas in the 2024 elections, while the nature has also changed to video and audio-based platforms, the message has also changed to playing between the relationships of the political elite and away from identity politics. This is another challenge that fact checkers, election management bodies have struggled to adapt to, because they're still playing by the 2019 playbook, whereas the game in 2024 has fundamentally changed. Moving on towards mapping vulnerabilities towards disinformation during elections. So at Safer Internet Lab, we did a national survey across all the provinces in Indonesia. Excuse me. We surveyed around 1,300 people and asked them questions regarding disinformation, trying to map out vulnerabilities as well as the impact of disinformation towards them in previous election cycles. So this was done in September 2023, even before the campaign period started. So these are perceptions that were gained before the elections. According to the results, the first vulnerability that we identified was a low level of independent verification for information. So Indonesian people, despite their increasing exposure to social media and the internet and information that arrives to them digitally, do not have the habit yet of verifying information. And when they do, they verify either just through a Google search, and then you can get whatever through a Google search, depending on the algorithm, or by asking friends, asking the WhatsApp group, asking sort of word-of-mouth sources. So this is one of the vulnerabilities as to why disinformation campaigns work so well in Indonesia, is because the habit of building the habit of verifying the information that you receive has not been built yet in Indonesian people. Number two is also the low level of access to fact-checking mediums. While fact-checking mediums, fact-checkers, official government sources, these things are available to the public, there's limited knowledge as to where to access them because when they Google search or try to find an answer online, the top results are rarely fact-checking. So I think this is one of also reasons as to why disinformation works so well in the Indonesian information landscape, is because, as you can see on the left pie chart, 81% have never checked a fact-checking website, even though they have tried to find verified sources of information. And number three and number four is that most of the public is unaware that disinformation campaigns in Indonesia are often an organized or structured movement. This is mostly, so because they don't believe in it, they think that it's mostly just pranksters or people trying to rile up certain political narrative, but working individually instead of an organized campaign either backed by a certain party. So it's two sides to the story, right? On the one hand, you don't want to say that everything is a political disinformation campaign, but on the other hand, you also don't want to discount disinformation incidents as, oh, that's just a one-time thing. It was an individual actor that had nothing to do with certain political parties. So I think that Indonesian people are still on the latter side, where they think it's just prankster behavior trying to rile up sensation for their own accounts, as opposed to deliberate acts. And number four is also similar to the fact-checking one. There's low level of information literacy and limited access to information literacy programs. This pie chart is even more telling that 96.7% have never attended a digital literacy program, despite the fact that the number of people who are accessing the internet has increased. So I have 4 minutes. I'll try to wrap it up as quick as I can. We also try to map out the impact of disinformation on elections and sort of trust towards election management bodies and the democratic process more broadly. Impact number one is that disinformation has the potential to lower the public's trust in EMBs in Indonesia. And again, I'd like to stress that this survey was held prior to the elections. So if you follow Indonesian politics, there was the Dirty Vote documentary and a lot of people sort of debunking how there were certain election interference methods outside of the information landscape through social assistance programs, through vote buying, that occurred under the watch of our election management bodies. So we gathered these insights before all of that was unearthed, and even then there was already a sizable amount of the population who did not trust election management bodies and the democratic process more broadly. And this is likely because of exposure to disinformation in previous election cycles, saying that the election was rigged, the results were as a result of corruption or methods that were not democratic. So I think these are the takeaways of that. Number two, as we covered before, it also has the potential to decrease the public's trust in election integrity. We see that the number of people who believe in certain disinformation cases are more likely to distrust the integrity of the 2024 elections, even before the fact that the 2024 elections were flawed, were unearthed. So the impact of disinformation towards the 2024 elections can be traced back to campaigns that were occurring before that. And lastly, it could also impact the support for democracy. As we've covered before, the same thing over and over again, right? This is a survey that was conducted prior to the 2024 elections, and already people were discounting the democratic process and the integrity of the election because of campaigns, disinformation campaigns that were held years ago. And just a brief way forward. Obviously, this is still very, very early days in the research, and we've yet to come to decisive conclusions and recommendations. But broadly speaking, I think the main way to tackle and address disinformation campaigns is a sort of a multi-stakeholder approach. And it's obviously very much easier than done. Even when civil society and platforms are on the same page on disinformation, oftentimes political will fluctuates depending on the nature and source of the disinformation. As I said before, some political candidates might be more willing to let disinformation campaigns run loose because it ties in with certain political benefits that they gain, or it is according to their narrative, or they're the perpetrators themselves. So I think getting all these stakeholders within the domestic information landscape and the region more broadly on the same page will be a step forward towards addressing these issues more comprehensively. And number two, without stating the obvious, emerging technologies, AI, generated audio, visual, and so on and so forth, will intensify the speed, nature, and spread of disinformation. This is one of the things that fact checkers in Indonesia, and I think the region more broadly, struggles with, because fact checking takes a longer time than spreading disinformation does, especially when that disinformation is aided by Gen AI, which is sort of disinformation on steroids. And lastly, I think it's really also important to remember that there is a balance that needs to be struck between effective governance of the information landscape and ensuring democratic freedoms for people in democratic countries. I think oftentimes the approaches can be a little bit top-down, and then that can lead to restrictions of what you can say and what you can do. We've seen instances of like this in Indonesia. So I think striking that balance between effective governance of disinformation and the information landscape and ensuring democratic freedoms to make sure that people can say what they want, more kind of, in the information landscape is crucial. And with that, I'd like to pass it back to Gulizar. Thank you.
Thank you for your comprehensive presentation. Next up, Dr. Bradshaw.
Awesome. Thanks so much. I just want to, like all the other speakers today, thank the organizers for hosting me here to speak with you all and share some thoughts on AI misinformation and the 2016. I'm so used to talking about the 2016 US election, the 2024 US election. My name is Dr. Samantha Bradshaw. I'm currently an assistant professor at American University, the School of International Service, and I'm also the director of the Center for Security, Innovation, and New Technology. A lot of my research focuses on tracking mis and disinformation by foreign actors and analyzing not only the tools and techniques and narratives that are prominent in contemporary disinformation campaigns, but also trying to measure their impact on actual individuals' attitudes, behaviors, and opinions when it comes to participating in democracy and political processes. So today, for this panel, I'm going to focus specifically on generative AI and what we've learned from the US elections. Some of my focus will talk specifically about FIMI. Others will look more broadly at the use of generative AI in the US election context. And, just to sound like a broken record here, everybody has already kind of pointed to the fact that 2024 was supposed to be this big super election year, millions and millions of people going to the polls, and generative AI at the beginning of the year was this really looming threat. There was so much concern around how innovations and new technology and generative AI were going to change the disinformation game and how they were going to empower bad actors in new and creative ways that we were really potentially unprepared to address. Fast forward to the end of the year, and now a lot of commentators are kind of taking a step back and reflecting on this and saying, wow, maybe we overhyped some of the challenges that we thought generative AI were going to bring to FIMI, misinformation, disinformation, and trust in the information ecosystem more broadly. So for my presentation, I'm going to kind of talk about what these big threats were, what were some of the things that a lot of people were really concerned about in the lead up to elections this year, particularly with the focus on the US context. Did these concerns actually live up to their hype? Where did we see actual kind of creative uses of generative AI? Where could they have potentially had some effects? And then what can we learn going forward when we're thinking about the use of generative AI in elections and protecting against FIMI and disinformation related threats? So in terms of structure, we're going to go through kind of 4 key challenges. I'll present the debate to you, and then we'll talk about what actually happened and what we saw. So for the first challenge, a lot of commentators were really focused on this idea that misinformation, propaganda, disinformation, these narratives would become more persuasive compared to the past, because now we'd have this great new tools to increase the overall quality of misinformation and therefore its persuasive potential. So, some examples include being able to correct spelling and grammar. If you are a foreign agent and you are trying to influence elections in the US, maybe you don't have full English language proficiency, maybe you want to reach the Spanish-speaking audiences, and so being able to correct a lot of spelling and grammar was some of the things that a lot of disinformation researchers were concerned about at the time as one of this kind of new innovations in the tooling. We could also think about other, not just like ChatGPT and language models, but deepfake technologies and just a way to make images and video content or even audio content look and feel and seem more real and appealing. And we know that, images and video and this kind of content is generally really engaging, especially compared to textual-based content. And there's a large body of kind of, research in psychology that supports how certain kinds of images and videos are more memorable and resonate more with particular people when they're consuming information online. So it's kind of one side of the debate and some of the concerns around the quality of misinformation. In contrast, a lot of critics and skeptics out there made the argument that, it's already really easy to create good lies. We have Photoshop, we have cheap fakes. I have the classic image of the Nancy Pelosi cheap fake video where her the audio was just slowed down slightly to make her sound like she was drunk. That didn't actually require any fancy generative AI tooling. It was just good old-fashioned editing photos and videos. There's been some academic research that has looked into this question, particularly within the context of generative AI and foreign interference. Some of my former colleagues from Stanford, they ran this great survey experiment to see if we take disinformation narratives and run them through ChatGPT, can we make them more compelling towards audiences? Can we make them seem more interesting? And they found that yes, generative AI could make information operations content a little bit more persuasive, but the most effective kind of strategy was when a human then went in and edited the text prompts. And so human curation and production is still vastly superior to anything that generative AI or these language models can produce when it comes to making content more persuasive. In terms of what we saw in the US election, outright generative AI lies didn't really become more believable. A lot of the content that was produced was political satire and memes and was sort of interpreted that way. This is just the kind of famous example of Trump sharing deep fakes of Taylor Swift supporting his candidacy. No one was really believed it or was persuaded any more so by this kind of content. But I think what the real challenge that this kind of points to is how a lot of the memes still leveraged the growing polarization and the social cleavages around like race and identity within the US to generate salience and to generate more visibility and persuasiveness. And so it's not necessarily that the technology is new and having this new and profound impact, but it can tap into things that already exist and those feelings that already exist within and across US societies. The second challenge and the second kind of big debate and concerns that a lot of people raised in the early days of 2024 has to do with the idea that generative AI is going to increase the overall quantity of misinformation out there because it's going to be so much cheaper and easier to produce. The concerns were that there is going to be this overall flooding of the zone of our information ecosystem, which would make it really hard for the average person to sort through all of the information that's being bombarded at them and tell truth from fiction. At the same time, in the disinformation space, myself and a lot of my colleagues were really concerned about our ability to detect FIMI and other kinds of coordinated inauthentic behavior. Signals like copy-pasta campaigns could be replaced by unique messaging. For those of you who don't know what copy-pasta is, it's essentially taking a message in your disinformation campaign, copying it and pasting it over and over through different accounts that are part of your network. And so I know this is a little hard to read, but this is just a classic example of here's a copy-pasta campaign, and then I, on the right, have asked ChatGPT to write me 10 different versions of that message. And so as researchers, it would be really hard to find those nodes in the network if they're not all saying the exact same thing. And so there's much more digging and verification that needs to kind of happen on top of just being able to kind of quickly search to see if narratives and messaging are the same. On the other hand, I like to temper a lot of these concerns of flooding the zone with the idea that, actually, the average internet user doesn't really consume that much misinformation. There have been a lot of studies out there that have shown that misinformation does tend to exist in a lot of echo chambers, particularly in the US context. And this might not be different, this might be different for other countries in the world, but in the US context, misinformation is largely consumed by people who are partisan, people who go out of their way to look for misinformation because they're already conspiratorial, and people who have low trust in institutions, and so they don't trust the media or other kind of mainstream sources to give them news and information. In terms of what we actually saw happening, there was certainly an overall increase in the amount of AI-generated news and information and spam at the time. We also have seen a lot of examples of adversaries using generative AI in their kind of FIMI operations targeting the US, and Graham talked about some of those in his keynote speech, but I think I have some of the same reservations as he does, because when it comes to actually measuring engagement with this kind of content and understanding how they're reaching audiences, a lot of that is still really questionable and not really well studied. Generative AI content still has to compete within our algorithmically generated information environment, and there's only a limited amount of attention that people have to interact with this kind of content. We also, I think another big concern is that the quantity of AI-generated news can reinforce a lot of the existing challenges that we already see with media and local media in particular being able to compete in this algorithmically mediated information environment. If there is kind of this overall increase in the quality of junk content out there, we need to think of ways to empower and support and inform people through local journalism and professionally produced news, and allow these kinds of organizations to compete on social media and generate advertising revenue. And I think finally, the overall questions of quantity really reinforce these questions around how we actually cover and talk about generative AI in mainstream media and public discussions, because if we're constantly telling people that they can't trust anything they see because everything out there is fake, we're eroding the trust that's needed to actually make democracies function, to let people kind of go out and find information, develop opinions that are necessary to debate ideas and select political leaders. And so there's big bigger, deeper questions around how we're thinking about and talking about generative AI's actual threats to democracy. Okay, I'm going to go through these last two relatively quickly because I got 6 minutes left. So challenge number 3, there is a lot of concerns that generative AI would make propaganda and misinformation much more personalized compared to in the past. Using generative AI, individuals can craft political advertisements and messages that are far more personalized and tailored to a particular individual or group of people. We already know that academic researchers have been able to use these tools to mimic survey respondents when they're trying to pre-test some survey results. We've been able to also replicate classic behavioral economic studies using fake respondents through this kind of tooling. And so this shows the power of these models to sort of play with different concepts of people and develop sort of tailored messages to those audiences. And when we're thinking from the disinformation researcher standpoint, it allows and provides a medium for these actors to then go through and A/B test messages using these technologies to figure out which ones might resonate with certain audiences, develop those pre-surveys in this ChatGPT interface and see if certain messages might appeal more or less to certain kinds of people or groups of individuals, therefore making personalization much more powerful than before. The political micro-targeting debate, though, is actually really, really contested, and there have always been a lot of concerns that, our ability to sway people through these targeted political ads, it's not really straightforward, and it's actually a really kind of complex debate. There's a lot of studies out there that show political ads don't actually really persuade people to engage in different kinds of behaviors than they otherwise would. A lot of the effects are really small and context dependent, and it tends to galvanize people more than actually change their minds. So political ads are really good at getting Trump supporters to show up to his rallies, but it's not good at making a Harris voter all of a sudden vote for Trump. So there's sort of differing effects there when it comes to the actual persuasive power of personalized messaging. We also know a lot of people don't really pay attention to political ads, and so creating more personalized messages using generative AI might not even reach the audiences that people care about reaching. And then finally, LLMs don't have personal data about individuals. There's a lot of public data that they have about high-profile individuals, but when it comes to everyday people, they don't really have that kind of level of personalized data, which can lead to a lot of overgeneralizations and stereotypes when it comes to the output that they're producing about kinds of audiences. In terms of what we saw in the US elections, we saw that a lot of political groups did experiment with generative AI advertisements and campaign messaging, personalizing certain ads for certain constituents. There's some really interesting work that's been done by some of my friend and colleague, Dean Jackson. He interviewed a lot of the political campaigners that were working on campaigns throughout the US in the lead up to 2020, and a lot of them saw really positive uses rather than focusing on the negative, as a way to maybe reach new voters that were undecided with messages and getting them to engage in new ways. There was a lot of excitement, I think, around the opportunities of these technologies rather than focusing on some of the harms. But I think when we're thinking about the challenges on the horizon, it's really important to remember that the biggest challenge that generative AI and ads and personalization is still really an old one, and that's, what is the transparency behind how different political parties are using campaign advertisements, and where's the accountability and transparency in those processes. Okay. And finally, the last challenge, I just forgot to change the heading. The last challenge is that misinformation and generative AI might make content that could suppress voter turnout and voter behavior and participation in elections. We know that deepfakes have been used around the world to target female candidates and politicians, and there's a large and growing body of really important work that shows the kinds of demobilization effects that these kinds of activities can have on people who are fall victim to those kinds of activities. We also know that other kinds of generative AI technologies can be used to suppress voters by, creating robocalls that are telling people to go and vote on the wrong day and disrupt the kind of election process in that sense. And this is actually one area that a lot of researchers are still concerned about. Graham had mentioned that expert group that had gotten together and talked about the various kind of threats that a lot of misinformation experts were predicting would happen in the 2024 election. I was part of that group, and this was one of the areas where there was extreme consensus among all the experts, was the way that these technologies could be used to suppress participation, to suppress political involvement. Where there was kind of disagreement was sort of more along the lines of how these tools would be used and whether or not, traditional mechanisms of voter suppression would be more prominent and suffice compared to the generative AI improvements. And during the 2024 elections, we did see some examples of voter suppression through these tools. There was the infamous kind of robocall, which was an audio deepfake of Biden telling people not to vote in the US primary elections in New Hampshire, I think, and instead to save their vote for the main US presidential election. This was a campaign that cost $1 and took less than 20 minutes for the creator to make. But, I think it's, again, kind of one of the areas that we should really be paying attention to when we're thinking about some of the real concerns of generative AI and elections, because there are a lot of laws lacking in this space, and in a country like the US, there's a long history of voter suppression tactics already. So just to wrap up, in terms of what I think are some of the real challenges, the first is the idea that it's polarization and not persuasion. We really need to think about some of the deeper challenges that exist within the US and the democracy around polarization. And these narratives resonate because people are polarized, not because they're generatively produced by AI. The second is, how we cover and think and talk about AI can really affect people's ability to trust media, which is foundational to making our democracies work and function. The third is that, a lot of the personalization concerns are going to re-raise a lot of transparency concerns around how campaigns are using political advertising in the social media space. And then finally, we need practices and laws and protections around voter suppression strategies. We need to think about this as one of the more serious threat vectors, not only on the FIMI front, but generally, I think, if we're interested in protecting democracies. So I will stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your insightful presentation. Next up, Professor Cesarini, please.
Okay. Yes. So good afternoon, and many thanks to the organizers of this event. It has been an excellent opportunity so far to exchange views across such different voices and experiences. And I realized that my presentation is the only thing that remains between you and the exit. So I'll try to stick to the time and not to overload as already very rich day of information. Let me start by saying something that I think is key. When we talk about FIMI and disinformation, we should not lose sight of the fact that these phenomena have both a security implication, but also a deeper and wider societal consequences. There are two aspects, therefore, that needs to be tackled at the same time, and in order to fully cater for the social, societal implications, I think that the necessary way ahead it is to integrate the fundamental principle and the fundamental freedoms as a starting point. This is a bit in a nutshell what the European experience that I would like to share with you today has been kind of focusing on since a number of years, since when the policies designed to tackle disinformation has been enacted. So the point of departure is about how to mitigate risks involved in this phenomenon while respecting the fundamental rights, and how to guarantee that the citizens have effectively the right to exercise their own democratic rights by relying on information that they trust and on which they can rely. If that is the starting point, the response, it is necessary to be multidimensional. One of the elements of disinformation phenomenon today, a phenomenon that has always existed in history, is that there has been a technological, digital revolution that has affected the way that the information is imparted and received by citizens. And that, in that context, that against that backdrop, the online platforms, the major tech companies, have inevitably played an enormous role in terms of vectors, amplifiers of disinformation. So one of the pillars of the policies enacted in the EU, it is to make online platforms more transparent and accountable through soft and a hard law. I'll come back on this point in a second. The second pillar of the action, it has been about improving the capabilities of public institutions to detect, analyze, and expose foreign interference and hybrid threats. And the third pillar, it is more towards the society as a whole. And it has been an endeavor, an effort to raise citizens' awareness and strengthening societal resilience through different programs revolving around the concept of media and information literacy. All that requires there is an underlying layer across these three pillars, which is the implementation of an effective whole of society approach, so a multi-stakeholder approach that should be inclusive, so encompass media, civil society, academia, and the private sector, in particular the tech company, in order to understand threats that are constantly evolving, to have responses that are well balanced, that are calibrated, that are respectful of fundamental rights, therefore, and ultimately to empower professional journalism to regain audiences. The problems today, and it's a bracket I would like to open here. It is true that disinformation has not reached a wider audience, including Gen AI driven disinformation, that the audiences for disinformation remains limited. But the problem is that the audience for news in general is decreasing. The real phenomenon that we need to watch out today, it is news avoidance. People do not want to get informed anymore. That, I think, is a challenge that we need to factor in the future. So let me go very quickly. This is a bit historically how in the EU the policies against disinformation has been evolving. It started with the first invasion of Ukraine, of Crimea, in 2014, followed by the dawning of the MH17, the Malaysian Airlines, that was crossing the airspace of Crimea and was shot down by the Russian troops. And that was really an alarm that rang, a bell that rang very loud in the EU, that decided to take a first action by creating a Stratcom within the EEAS, the External Action Service of the European Union, and to create a framework for a joint framework to contrast hybrid threats. That was the starting point. And then in the following years, there has been a number of regulatory and non-regulatory actions that have been taken. I have been, actually, prior to the job that I do today, which is the chair of the executive board of the European Digital Observatory, that we'll talk about in a second. At that time, until 2020, I was actually leading the team that was countering disinformation in the European Commission, so working closely with the colleagues in the External Action Services for what then afterwards has been called FIMI operations. So that process has been quite painful and very intense. That is the point. But the focus that I would like to make, it is about three aspects that I mentioned before. The first was making online platforms more accountable. Yes, but how? So if you go immediately with regulating fake news, you may really fall into anti-democratic traps very easily. You regulate speech, and to regulate speech entails a lot of undesirable consequences, to put it mildly. So the question was more how to mitigate the risk through voluntary commitments that the companies would take from themselves, but in a context of a multi-stakeholder engagement. So not only the tech company, but also the advertising industry was involved in this talk. And later on, also civil society organization and media joined up this common effort to create minimum standards of behavior to impede or to kind of disrupt the infrastructure for information manipulations, which in most of the cases were using the platforms, the social media platforms, as the main driver, as a main vector, as a main amplifying tool. So the code of practice of disinformation is a soft law instrument that engaged the company to tackle a number of risks. One, it is and it has been mentioned before, it is linked to the fact that disinformation is a source of revenues for many actors. So demonetizing disinformation, it is a first step in order to eliminate that strong incentive. The second one, it is to increase the transparency when the disinformation is propelled through ads, in particular political ads. The third one is really to engage the companies, the tech companies, in effectively identifying and curtailing information, manipulation of their own services, technical, so what Facebook basically calls CIBs, coordinating authentic behaviors, but there is a number of different techniques and tactics that can be implemented on social media services in order to manipulate the information distribution. Then another important point is how to empower the users. How to empower the users means how the algorithmic black boxes can actually be turned out in order to expose users to more trustworthy information and less clickbait, to put it simple. And then there are other features like to increase the cooperation with key actors like researchers and fact-checkers. That soft law was the first step that was then has been now combined with the Digital Services Act, which is hard law, that together forms what we call a co-regulatory framework that, in essence, provide for a regulatory backstop and sanctions in case the voluntary commitments taken by the platforms are not fulfilled in practice. The mechanism is that every year the platforms need to have a self-assessment. They have to self-assess their own risks, systemic risks. There are independent audits, and the risk mitigation measures that the platforms need to put in place have to be sufficiently convincing to get over this auditing, independent oversight, if you want. And in cases not, the compliance is not assured, then there's hefty sanctions for the platforms going up to 6% of the global turnover. So let's see, we are at the beginning of the implementation phase. Let's see whether this system will really be effective in inducing more discipline and more safety for users in the online space. The second pillar is about raising the abilities of public authorities to counter FIMIs, malign foreign interference operations. Over the years, the EU has been enhancing strategic communications, has been creating a system where the public authorities can more easily exchange information between them through a rapid alert system, has extended collaboration with like-minded countries, including within NATO and the G7, and has kind of pulled together a toolbox against FIMI that includes also coordinated action to impose costs on perpetrators. The sanctions in the aftermath of the full invasion of Ukraine in 2022 that included the boycott of Russia Today and Sputnik is one example of the cost that joint action can actually lead to. The third element, it is really, and that is very important, creating an enabling environment for media freedom and resilient democracy. That is a difficult part to implement in practice. There has been, again, legislation, new legislation. The European Media Freedom Act try to preserve the safety of journalists that are increasingly under attack, so independent journalism need to be protected, to also ensure that media are truly independent in their editorial policies, so free from governmental influence, although may be public media like public broadcasters, but the editorial line need to be independent. Protecting free and fair elections implies also increasing the level of responsibilities of political actors in terms of transparency, in terms of how they use the digital media to promote their own campaign through paid ads, for instance, for political advertising. Supporting media and information literacy is a very large and complex endeavor because in Europe we have 27 different educational systems that need to be brought together, and support for this specific element in the curricula, it is not an obvious thing to get through throughout the whole EU. And also it is not only time-consuming, but also resource-intensive from the financial point of view. So there is a need for funding for democracy in general, to support media literacy, but also to support independent journalism that it is, as everybody knows, in many countries facing a very difficult transition throughout the digital transformation phase, and in the aftermath of the increased power of social media platforms as main channels of as main gatekeepers, let's say, for citizens to access information. Now, in this context, EDMO comes as a real element to catalyze efforts for the whole of society approach by supporting fact-checking activities, for coordinating academic research, for promoting EU-wide media literacy campaigns, and to provide feedback for policy developments. EDMO, it is quite a complex body with a central coordination platform where I work, and with 14 national hubs that cover the whole territory of the Union, and that are able to act in very different linguistic realities and with very different political challenges and information environments. So the few minutes that remains, I would like to just give you a glance at what EDMO has done during the European election that we have just been going through. The EDMO task force, it has been an experiment that we have been putting on motion, leveraging the capabilities of the fact-checkers across the whole Europe, across all the hubs, and to have a constant, a daily monitoring of the information space in the 6 weeks ahead of the election and in the months that followed the election date, which was from the 6th to the 9th of June. The objective here was to have a systematic debunking of the most harmful campaign. For instance, the doppelganger campaign has been monitored throughout. Other campaigns have been identified, like the Portal Combat, which is still, again, of Russian origin, like the Matryoshka operation, again, of Russian origin, but also the Wallpaper operation, which is Chinese origin. So there has been a number of organized campaigns during the whole phases that pre-existed and went on through the whole election campaign phases. And the novelty here was to have a daily monitoring of these activities, so a daily exposure of these activities, and a rapid response systems that was organized within the code of practice, which enabled a direct channel of communication with the platforms in order to take the necessary measures, which was not necessarily taking down the content or the deplatformization of certain accounts. Warnings, labels were also applied in order to mitigate the amplification of these narratives for the less risky type of operations. But that was, again, the first time where this type of direct channel of communication and rapid response system was put in action. And this experience has been quite positive and has been replicated also in the latest election in Moldova and in Georgia. The lesson, so that is, you can see, however, that there is a tendency during the election phase for EU-related disinformation really to increase, which means that despite this spotlight that was put on the phenomenon, disinformation still proliferated, moving up from 5–10% of all detected disinformation up to 15, almost 20 in some days, percent of all detected disinformation in the very last phase of the campaign. The narratives that were affected there was, escalation of the war in Ukraine. So that was really very much used across all campaigns in the 27 member states as a way to create polarization in the voters, across the voters. Climate change, another big topic, another big ticket for disinformers. Stories that were questioning the relevance and the legitimacy of European elections as a non-democratic institution. And migration. Migrations, it is a real issue in Europe. Identity policies are very strongly captured by the extreme rights, and the narrative where migrants are seizing power in the EU has really managed to gain ground or to strengthen the beliefs of many people across Europe during this electoral phase. So what lessons, what outcomes, what impact we have had as EDMO in all this? I think one thing is to be acknowledged. There has not been measure impact. In the last days, there has not been the trigger for a major accident in any of the 27 electoral processes that take place simultaneously to renew the European Parliament. There are 27 different electoral processes, so it's a complex machinery. So, but no major action has happened anywhere across Europe. That is has to be recognized. And if the Russian propaganda was about delegitimizing the election process and basically push the voters away from the vote, telling them it is not relevant, don't go to vote, well, that campaign has not succeeded. The turnout has been the highest during the last 20 years, and that is a positive indication. And I think the higher awareness, the spotlight on the fence that has been lit up by ETMO has helped in order to raise the level of deterrence and possibly improve the resilience of our system. But the good news stopped there, because on the other side, I think we need to understand that there has been a proliferation in any event during the campaign on disinformation. This is one thing. And the second thing is that one needs to realize that disinformation does not act anymore like in the 2016 campaign in the US presidentials or for the Brexit, as a kind of the last minute bomb that may alter the result of the election. This is a drip drop strategy that starts much before the election phases, that aims at shaping the public opinion through narratives that are repeated over and over, and little by little gain grounds and kind of influence people by the simple fact of the repetition of these narratives over time. And therefore, there is a need for a long-term endeavor if you want to counter this phenomenon. So and that is the last slide. There are three main lessons learned that I would like to share with you. The first is that the growing geopolitical instability continues to provide strong political and economic incentives for FIMI attacks and for disinformers in general within our democracies. The enforcement of the law of the Digital Services Act is important but not sufficient. It's necessary but not sufficient. I think the public authorities, governments need to understand that the long-term funding and structural support for the maintenance of this whole of society approach to support fact-checking, to support research, to support media literacy action and initiatives across longer period of times with a long-term perspective is essential. The second one is about the pervasiveness of AI systems. I'm not talking only about generative AI, I'm talking about AI in general. The way the AI systems operate within digital services is a challenge. If it is not always persuasive, it is pervasive. And the long-term effects could be seen in terms of decreasing trust in media altogether. And that is one of the points that Samantha highlighted before, and I fully share, actually. So again, legislation on AI is important, but not sufficient. It's important also to develop and deploy pro-social AI systems through adequate, again, funding and endeavors by technologists, by companies, by the private sector. And finally, we have to recognize that our public spheres, I'm talking about Europe, I don't want to make judgment about anybody else, but in Europe, our public spheres is deteriorating. It's deteriorating because of the phenomenon I said before. People are less and less prone to listen to news, to read authoritative sources. They are more capturing information wherever it happens to be. And the news media, professional news media, are really struggling to remain sustainable in the long term. So again, legislation is important but not sufficient. The European Media Freedom Act is a very important step forward, but an industrial policy for media to ensure long-term sustainability of news media, professional editorial news media, is also a necessary complement. Thank you very much.
Thank you.